When are feelings illusions? Hovering over the question posed by the title of this chapter is a larger question. What the hell are we talking about here? Illusions are things that seem to be true, but aren't, and what it would even mean to say that feelings are true or false. Feelings just are. If we feel them, then they're feelings. Real feelings, not imagined feelings. End of story. There's something to be said for this point of view. In fact, one of the take-home lessons of Buddhist philosophy is that feelings just are. If we accepted their arising and subsiding as part of life rather than reacting to them as if they were deeply meaningful, we'd often be better off. Learning to do that is a big part of what mindfulness meditation is about. And there are lots of satisfied customers who attest that it works. Still, saying that it works isn't the same as saying that it's intellectually valid. Just because being less reactive to some of your feelings makes you happier doesn't mean it brings you a truer apprehension of the world. Maybe less reactive stance is like a narcotic. It dulls the pain by insulating you from the real world feedback that your feelings provide. Maybe it's meditation, not your ordinary consciousness, that puts you in a dream world. If we want to see whether meditation does, in fact, bring you closer to the truth, it helps to ask whether some of the feelings it can liberate you from would otherwise have carried you away from the truth. So we need to try to get a handle on this admittedly unwieldy question. Are our feelings in some sense false or true? Are some false and some true? And which are which? One way to approach these questions is to go back in evolutionary time. Way back. Back to when feeling first arose. And sadly, no one knows exactly when that was, or even approximately when that was. Was it back when mammals appeared, or reptiles, or squishy blobs floating in the sea? One-celled creatures such as bacteria? One reason it's hard to say is that feelings have an odd property. You can never absolutely be positively sure that anyone or anything other than you has them. Part of the definition of a feeling is that it's private, not visible from the outside. So I don't know for sure that, say, my dog Fraser has feelings. Maybe that wagging tail is just a wagging tail. But just as I seriously doubt that I'm the only human with feelings, I seriously doubt that my species is the only species with feelings. I suspect that when my cousin, the chimpanzee, writhes in seeming pain, it is writhing in actual pain. And if from chimpanzees you go down the ladder of behavioral complexity, down to wolves, lizards, even jellyfish, and what the hell, bacteria, I don't see an obvious place to stop assuming that there are or aren't feelings. Anyway, regardless of when feelings first arose, there is a rough consensus among behavioral scientists on what the original function of good feelings and bad feelings was. To get organisms to approach things or avoid things that are respectively good for them or bad for them. Nutrients, for example, keep organisms alive. So natural selection favored genes that gave organisms feelings that led them to approach things containing nutrients, that is, food. You may be familiar with such feelings. Things that harm or kill organisms, in contrast, are best avoided. So natural selection gave organisms feelings that inclined them to avoid such things. Feelings of aversion. To approach or to avoid is the most elemental behavioral decision there is. And feelings seem to be the tool natural selection used to get organisms to make what, by natural selection's lights, was the right decision. After all, Your average animal isn't smart enough to think, that substance is rich in carbohydrates, which give me energy, so I'll make a habit of approaching and ingesting it, perhaps instead of something else that is maybe healthier or less healthy, but tastier. In fact, your average animal isn't even smart enough to think, food good for me, so I approach. Feelings arose as proxies for this kind of thinking. The inviting warmth of a campfire on a freezing night means that staying warm is better for us than freezing. The pain caused by actual contact with the fire means that there's such a thing as too much warmth. The job of these and other feelings is to convey to the organism that what's good for it and what's bad for it. As the biologist George Romanes put it in 1884, 25 years after Darwin's The Origin of Species appeared, he says, pleasures and pains must have been evolved as the subjective accompaniment of processes which are respectively beneficial or injurious to the organism, and so evolved for the purpose or to the end that the organism should seek the one and shun the other. This suggests one way to think about whether feelings are true or false. Feelings are designed to encode judgments about things in our environment. Typically, these judgments are about whether these things are good or bad for the survival of the organism doing the feeling. Though sometimes they're about whether these things are good or bad for close kin, notably offspring, since close kin share so many of our genes. So we could say that feelings are true if the judgments they encode are accurate. If, say, the things they attract the organism to are indeed good for it, or if the things they attract the organism to avoid are indeed bad for it. We could say feelings are false or perhaps illusory if they led the organism astray, if feeling the feelings led to things that are bad for the organism. This isn't the only way you could define true and false in a biological context, but it's one approach. So let's see how far we can get with it. Obsolete urges. Take powdered sugar donuts again. I personally have very warm feelings towards them. So warm that if I were guided only by my feelings, I would eat them for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and as in-between meal snacks. Yet I'm told that actually eating that many donuts each day would be bad for me. So I guess my feeling of attraction to powdered sugar donuts could be called false. These donuts feel good, but this is an illusion because they're not really good for me. This is, of course, hard news to take. It calls to mind the plaintive lyrics of that old Luther Ingram song, "If loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right." It also calls to mind a question. How could natural selection let something like this happen? Shouldn't our feelings direct us towards things that are good for the organism? They should, yes. But here's the thing. Natural selection designed our feelings in a particular environment, an environment with no junk food, an environment in which the sweetest thing available was fruit. So a sweet tooth served us well. It gave us feelings that, you might say, were true in the sense that they steered us towards things that were good for us. But in a modern environment, which features the achievement of culinary science known as empty calories, these feelings become false, or at least not reliably true. They sometimes tell us something is good when it is not good for us. There are quite a few feelings like this, feelings that back when they entered our lineage served our ancestors' interests, but that don't always serve our interests now. Take road rage. If the desire to punish people who treat you unfairly or show you disrespect is deeply human, and admit it. Though there's something unpleasant about being made angry, there's something pleasing about the feeling of anger itself, the feeling that you're rightfully enraged. The Buddha said anger has a poisoned root and honeyed tip. And you can see why natural selection would have made righteous rage attractive. In a small hunter-gatherer village, if someone took advantage of you and stole your food or stole your mate, or just generally treated you like dirt, you needed to teach them a lesson. After all, if they learn, they can get away with abusing you. I mean, if they learn that they can get away with abusing you, they might do it again and again. Worse still, others in your social universe will see that you can be thus exploited, so they might start treating you badly. In such an intimate, unchanging social environment, it would be worth your while to get so angry over exploitation that you would confront your exploiter and be willing to come to blows. Even if you lost the fight, even if you got battered pretty badly, you'd have sent the message that there's a cost for disrespecting you, and this message would pay dividends over time. You may already be pondering the absurdity of the way this feeling can play out in the modern highway. The disrespectful driver you feel like punishing is someone you'll never see again. And so are all the drivers who might witness any revenge you wreak. So there's no benefit whatsoever that comes from indulging your rage. And as for the cost, I'd guess that's chasing somebody in a car at 80 miles per hour is more likely to get you killed than what was the starting of a fist fight in a hunter-gatherer society. So you could call road rage false. It feels good, but the aura of goodness is illusory, because succumbing to its attraction leads to behavior that will not, on average, be good for the organism. There are lots of instances of off-road rage that are false, bursts of anger that are at best unproductive and at worst counterproductive. So if meditation did liberate you from obedience to these feelings, it would be, in a certain sense, dispelling an illusion. The illusion you implicitly subscribe to when you follow the feeling. The illusion that the rage, and for that matter, the revenge it inspires, is fundamentally good. It turns out the feeling isn't even good in the basic sense of self-interest. So that's one way to define true and false as they apply to feelings. If they feel good but lead us to do things that aren't really good for us, then they're false feelings. But there's another sense in which feelings can be true or false. Some feelings, after all, are more than feelings. They don't just imply judgments about whether doing certain things will be good for the organism. They come with actual, explicit beliefs about things in the environment and how they relate to the organism's welfare. Obviously, such beliefs can be true or false in a pretty straightforward sense. False positives. Suppose you're hiking through what you know to be rattlesnake terrain, and suppose you know that only a year ago someone hiking alone in this vicinity was bitten by a rattlesnake and died. Now suppose there's a stirring in the bush next to your feet. This stirring doesn't just give you a surge of fear. You feel the fear that there is a rattlesnake near you. In fact, as you turn quickly toward the disturbance and your fear reaches its apex, you may be so clearly envisioning a rattlesnake that if the culprit turns out to be a lizard, there will be a fraction of a second when the lizard looks like a snake. This is an illusion in a literal sense. You actually believe there is something there that isn't. In fact, you actually see it. These kinds of misinterpretations are known as false positives. From natural selection's point of view, they're a feature, not a bug. Though your brief conviction that you've seen a rattlesnake may be wrong 99 times out of 100, the conviction could be life-saving the other one time in 100. And in natural selection's calculus, being right 1% of the time in matters of life or death can be worth being wrong 99% of the time, even if in every one of those 99 instances you're briefly terrified. So there are actually two differences between the snake illusion on one side and the donut on the road and road rage illusions on the other. In the case of the snake, the illusion is explicit. It's an actual false perception about the physical world and, for a moment, a false belief. And two, in the case of the snake, your emotional machinery is working exactly as designed. In other words, the snake illusion isn't a result of environmental mismatch. It's not a case where a feeling designed by natural selection to be in some sense true in a hunter-gatherer environment was rendered false by circumstances of modern life. Rather, natural selection designed this feeling to be almost always illusory in a literal sense. The feeling fills you with a conviction, a judgment about what's in your immediate environment that is pretty reliably untrue. This is a reminder that natural selection didn't design your mind to see the world clearly. It designed your mind to have perceptions and beliefs that would help take care of your genes. Which brings us to a third difference between the donut and road rage illusions and the snake illusion. The snake illusion, in the long run, may well be good for you. It may keep you safe from harm that would otherwise befall you. The same goes for comparable illusions that, depending on where you live, might be more likely to visit you than a snake illusion. You might, while walking home one night, hear somebody walking behind you. You might think that it belongs to a mugger, though you're probably wrong. Crossing the street is a precaution that, over the course of your life, may prevent a crime that otherwise would have victimized you. I have a fear that all this may be sounding more clear-cut than it is. It may seem as if there are two kinds of false feelings: the unnatural environmental mismatch kind, and the natural false positive kind. And you should always ignore the former, whereas obeying the later makes sense. In the real world, it turns out these lines can get blurry. For example, have you ever been visited by the fear that something you said to someone had offended them? And has this person ever been someone you weren't going to see for a while? And has it been the case that you didn't know them very well? It would have been awkward to call them or send them an email to make sure you hadn't offended them, or to clarify that no offense was meant. The feeling itself, the concern that you've offended someone, is perfectly natural. Staying on good terms with people boosted our ancestors' chances of surviving and reproducing. Also, natural, perhaps, is the fact that in some cases you're exaggerating the chances that you've offended the person, even feeling bursts of certainty that you've done so. This may be another one of nature's false positives, the sense that you've erred may be designed to be so powerful that you'll take remedial action more often than it's really called for. What's not natural is that remedial action is so hard to take. In a hunter-gatherer village, the person you feared that you'd offended would live, about 30 meters from you, and you'd see them again in about 20 minutes or so. At that point, you could gauge her demeanor and perhaps be reassured that no offense was taken, or conclude that she was in fact miffed and tried to rectify the situation. In other words, the initial feeling, even if illusory, is probably natural, designed to appear on occasions like this. What's not natural or features of the modern world that make it hard to find out whether the feeling was or wasn't an illusion. So the feeling lasts longer than is likely to be of any practical value. And unfortunately, the feeling is unpleasant. Another unpleasant product of environmental mismatch is painful self-consciousness. We were designed by natural selection to care, and care a lot, about what other people think of us. During evolution, people who were liked, admired, and respected would have been more effective gene propagators than people who were the opposite. But in a hunter-gatherer village, your neighbors would have had a vast database on your behavior. So you'd be unlikely on any given day to do anything that radically revised their opinion of you, for better or worse. Social encounters wouldn't typically have been high-pressure events. In the modern world, we often find ourselves in the unnatural position of meeting someone who knows little or nothing about us. That can add a little pressure on the occasion. And it may add more if your mother was prone to saying, you get only one chance to make a good first impression. You may find yourself scanning the person for feedback so intensively that you start seeing things that aren't there. A social psychology experiment from the 1980s makes a point. A makeup artist put realistic-looking scars on the faces of the subjects who had been told that the purpose of the experiment was to see how a scar affected the people around them, how they would react. The subjects were to have a conversation with someone, and the experiments would observe the reaction. The subjects were shown their scars in a mirror, but then right before their social encounter, they were told that the scar needed a bit of work. Moisturizer would be added to keep it from cracking. In fact, though, the scar was removed. Then the subjects headed out to their social encounters with a warped idea of what they looked like. After the encounters, they were debriefed. Had they noticed their conversation partner reacting to the scar? They said, "Oh yes," many of them said. In fact, when they were shown the video of the conversation partner, they could point to these reactions. And sometimes, for example, the person would look away from them, obviously averting their eyes from the scar. So again, an uncomfortable feeling of self-consciousness sponsors a kind of perceptual illusion, a basic misreading of the behavior of others. Yes, and to clarify, these subjects with the scars were removed before they met the people, and they weren't told that. So they didn't have scars, and they were seeing things that didn't exist, these reactions from people. Modern life is full of emotional reactions that make little sense except in light of the environment in which our species evolved. You may be haunted for hours by some embarrassing thing you did on a public bus or on an airplane, even though you'll never again see the people who witnessed it, and their opinions of you therefore have no consequence. Why would natural selection design organisms to feel discomfort that seems so pointless? Maybe because in the environment of our ancestors, it wouldn't have been pointless. In a hunter-gatherer society, you're pretty much always performing in front of people you'll see again, and whose opinions therefore matter. My mother used to say, we wouldn't spend so much time worrying about what other people think of us if we realized how seldom they do. She was right. Our assumption that people give much thought to us one way or the other is often an illusion, as is our unspoken sense that it matters what pretty much everyone we see thinks of us. But these intuitions were less often illusory in the environment of our evolution, and that's one reason they're so persistent today. Public speaking and other horrors. If there is anything more unnatural than being in the presence of a bunch of people you've never seen before, it's speaking to all of them at once. The mere thought of such an event can give us terrifying illusions about the future. Suppose you're giving some kind of presentation tomorrow. Maybe it's a PowerPoint talk. Maybe it's a presentation in some looser sense. Now suppose one further thing, that you're like me. If you're like me, as the time approaches, you may feel anxiety. What's more, this anxiety may feature bursts of conviction that things are going to go badly. You may even envision specific disaster scenarios. And pretty reliably, these visions will turn out to be wrong in retrospect. These anxiety-sponsored bursts of apocalyptic conviction were false positives. Of course, it's possible that the anxiety is the reason things wound up going well. Maybe it spurred you to prepare a great presentation. If so, these false PowerPoint apocalypse positives are different from false rattlesnake positives. After all, your momentary fear that a rattlesnake was near you had no bearing on whether or not the rattlesnake would in fact be there. In contrast, your PowerPoint apocalypse anxiety may conceivably have headed off a PowerPoint apocalypse. Conceivably, but let's face it, though anxiety is sometimes productive in this sense, people do a lot of worrying that serves no good purpose. There are people who get beset by images of themselves getting violently sick while talking to a crowd, even though, come to think of it, that's never happened to them in front of a crowd. In a particularly perverse twist on PowerPoint apocalypse anxiety, I've been known to lie awake the night before a big presentation, worrying that if I don't go to sleep, I'll do a bad job the next day. Actually, that's an oversimplification. I don't just worry about not going to sleep. For the sake of variety, I periodically interrupt that worrying with bouts of self-loathing for being the kind of person who would worry so much about not getting enough sleep that he'd be unable to get sleep. Then after my rage has subsided, I would get back to the important business of worrying so much about not getting enough sleep that I can't get to sleep. I'm proud to say that this doesn't happen before most of my public speaking events. But it's happened, and I defy anyone to argue that it is natural selection's way of increasing my chances of surviving and reproducing. So too with lots of other anxieties related to human social interaction, a sense of dread before going to a cocktail party that, in fact, is very unlikely to lead to anything that is worth dreading. Worrying about how your child is doing at her first slumber party is something you're powerless to influence, or worrying about your PowerPoint presentation after you've given it, as if fretting over whether people liked it or will change whether they did. I'd guess that all three of these examples have at least something to do with the way our environment has changed since the human species evolved. Our ancestral environment didn't feature cocktail parties, slumber parties, or PowerPoints. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors didn't have to navigate roomfuls of people they'd never met, or send their children off to sleep in homes they've never seen, or give presentations to an audience consisting largely of people they didn't know very well, if at all. And by the way, this mismatch between our evolved nature and the environment in which we find ourselves isn't just a modern phenomenon. For thousands of years, there have been human social environments that weren't the ones we were designed for. The Buddha was born to a royal family, which means he lived in a society with clusters of population much bigger than a hunter-gatherer village. And though PowerPoint hadn't been invented, there is evidence that people were being called on to speak before large audiences, and that something like PowerPoint apocalypse anxiety had taken shape. In one discourse, the Buddha listed as one of the 5 fears, the fear of embarrassment in assemblies. This fear remains in the top 5 today. Some polls, in fact, show public speaking to be the most dreaded activity of all. Just to be clear, and at the risk of repeating myself, I'm not saying that social anxiety isn't in any sense a product of natural selection. The ancestral environment, the environment of our evolution, featured lots of social interaction, and this interaction had great consequences for our genes. If you had low social status and few friends, that cut your chances of spreading your genes, so impressing people mattered. Even if PowerPoint wasn't the thing you impressed them with. Similarly, if your offspring didn't thrive socially, that boded ill for their reproductive prospects and hence for your genes. That boded ill for their reproductive prospects and hence for your genes. So genes inclining us toward anxiety about our social prospects and our progeny's social prospects seem to have become part of the human gene pool. In this sense, our social anxieties can be considered natural, but they're operating in a very different environment from the environment they were designed for, and this fact may explain why they're often unproductive and sponsoring illusions that are of no value at all. Thus, can we have beliefs about, for example, the near certainty of impending disaster that are false both in the literal and the pragmatic sense? They aren't true and they aren't good for us. If you accept the idea that many of our most troublesome feelings are in one sense or another illusions, then meditation can be seen as, among other things, a process of dispelling illusions. Here's an example. In 2003, a couple of months after my first meditation retreat, I traveled to Camden, Maine, to give a talk at an annual conference called PopTech. The night before my talk, I woke up at 2 or 3 a.m. with one of my little bouts of anxiety. After a few minutes of staying awake, pondering the grave implications of staying awake, I decided to sit up in my bed and meditate. I focused on my breathing for a while, but I also focused on the anxiety itself, the tight feeling in my gut. I tried to look at it as I'd been taught to do at my meditation retreat, non-judgmentally. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and there was no reason to run away from it. It was just a feeling. So I sat there feeling it and watching it. I can't say that the feeling felt great, but the more I accepted it, observing it non-judgmentally, the less pleasant it got. And then something happened that was much like my big overcaffeination breakthrough at the meditation retreat. The anxiety now seemed like something removed from me, something I was just looking at in my mind's eye, the way I might look at an abstract sculpture in a museum. It looked like a kind of thick, knotted rope of tightness, occupying the part of my abdomen where anxiety is felt. But it didn't feel like tightness anymore. My anxiety, which had been painful only minutes earlier, now felt neither good nor bad. And not long after it attained this neutral status, it dissolved entirely. After a few minutes of this pleasant relief from suffering, I lay down and went to sleep. The next day my talk went, I'll pause here to let the suspense build, fine. It's possible, in principle, to attack anxiety from another angle. Rather than focus on the feeling itself, as I did that night, you investigate the thoughts associated with it. This is the way cognitive behavioral therapy works. Your therapist asks questions like, is there much likelihood of screwing up that presentation, judging by your history of giving presentations? And if you did screw up, would your career really vaporize on the spot? Then if you see that the thoughts are lacking in logic, the attendant's feelings may weaken. So cognitive behavior therapy is very much in the spirit of mindfulness meditation, both in some sense question the validity of the feelings. It's just that with cognitive behavioral therapy, the questioning is more literal. By the way, if you're thinking about combining these two approaches and becoming famous as the founder of a whole new school of therapy, I have bad news. Mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy, MBCBT, already exists. Levels of delusion, a recap. If I've done my job, you should be feeling a bit deceived. Not by me, but by your feelings. And I haven't even gotten to the deepest, subtlest deceptions perpetuated by your feelings. Perpetrated by your feelings. I'll save those for later in the book. Meanwhile, let's review several senses in which feelings can be misleading. Our feelings weren't designed to depict reality accurately, even in our natural environment. Feelings were designed to get the genes of our hunter-gatherer ancestors into the next generation. If that meant deluding our ancestors, making them so fearful that they see a snake that isn't actually there, so be it. This class of illusions, natural illusions, helps explain a lot of distortions in our apprehension of the world, especially the social world. Warped ideas about ourselves, about our friends, our kin, our enemies, our casual acquaintances, and even strangers. Which about covers it, right? The fact that we're not living in a natural environment makes our feelings even less reliable guides to reality. So feelings that are designed to create illusions, such as seeing a snake that isn't there, may at least have the virtue of increasing the organism's prospects for surviving and reproducing. But the modern environment can take various kinds of feelings that served our ancestors in this Darwinian sense and render them counterproductive in the same sense. They may actually lower a person's life expectancy. Violent rage and yearnings of a sweet tooth are good examples. These feelings were once true, at least in the pragmatic sense of guiding the organism toward behaviors that were in some sense good for it, beneficial, but now they're likely to mislead and be harmful. Underlying it all is the happiness delusion. As the Buddha emphasized, our ongoing attempts to feel better tend to involve an overestimation of how long better is going to last. What's more, when better ends, it can be followed by worse, an unsettled feeling, a thirst for more. Long before psychologists were describing the hedonic treadmill, the Buddha saw it. What he couldn't have seen is its source. We were built by natural selection, and natural selection works to maximize genetic proliferation. Period. In addition to not caring about the truth per se, it doesn't care about our long-term happiness. It will readily delude us about what does and doesn't bring us lasting happiness if that delusion has propelled our ancestors' genes forward. In fact, natural selection doesn't even care about our short-term happiness. Just look at the price of all those false positives, being terrified by a snake that isn't there 99 times in a row. That could take a toll on a person's psychological well-being. The good news, of course, is that on the 100th time, the fear may have helped keep our ancestors alive and thus led ultimately to the creation of us. Still, we are the hires of this tendency toward false positives, not just in the realm of snakes, but in the realm of other fears and everyday anxieties. As Aaron Beck, who is sometimes called the founder of cognitive behavior therapy, has written, the cost of survival of the lineage may be a lifetime of discomfort. Or as the Buddha would have put it, a lifetime of dukkha. And the Buddha might have added, but this cost is avoidable if you address the psychological causes of it head on. Obviously, this chapter hasn't been a blanket indictment of human feelings. Some, maybe most, of our feelings serve us reasonably well. They don't much distort our view of reality, and they help us alive, or keep us alive and flourishing. My attraction to apples, my aversion to grasping knife blades, and scaling skyscrapers. All to the good. Still, I hope you can see the virtue of subjecting your feelings to investigation, inspecting them to see which ones deserve obedience and which ones don't, and trying to free yourself from the grip of the ones that don't. And I hope you can see why this is difficult. It's in the nature of feelings to make it hard to tell the valuable ones from the harmful ones, the reliable from the misleading. One thing all feelings have in common is that they were originally designed to convince you to follow them. They feel right and true almost by definition. They actively discourage you from viewing them objectively. Maybe this helps explain why it took me so long to get the hang of mindfulness meditation. Why it never worked for me until I took the full immersion approach and went on a 1-week silent meditation retreat. But it's not the only reason. There are other things about the way feelings influence us that make it hard to turn the tables on them and reverse the servant-master relationship. And there are other things about the way the mind works that make it hard to sink into a meditative state in the first place. Indeed, it was only after I went on that first retreat that I started to realize how challenging it can be and why it can be so challenging to get to the point where mindfulness meditation is really working. Then again, rewarding things often require work. And another thing I started to realize on that retreat is how great the rewards of mindfulness meditation can be. Indeed, those rewards